Okay, Dennis.
Welcome to today's assembly hosted by Executive Intelligence Review. We will not be silenced, speaking truth in times of war. Since our last event on September 7th, the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation has issued a new kill list, adding more than 20 others, including a head of state. A story appeared in yesterday's New York Times titled, "U.S. believes Ukrainians were behind an assassination in Russia. American officials said they were not aware of the plan ahead of time for the attack that killed Daria Dugina and that they had admonished Ukraine over it." The first paragraph of their article reads, Washington. United States intelligence agencies believe parts of the Ukrainian government authorized the car bomb attack near Moscow in August that killed Daria Dugina, the daughter of a prominent Russian nationalist, an element of a covert campaign that US officials fear could widen the conflict. Now, for those who are with us today, perhaps for the first time, and may not be familiar with the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, here's a basic description. The Center for Countering Disinformation was established in 2021 under President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, and it is part of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. It has a stated aim to detect and counter what they call propaganda and destructive disinformation. And they issued, as of July of this year, a kill list. And we have now, with the new revised list, which came out only days ago, 35 Americans are on the list, as well as people from all over the world, including, by the way, the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni. Now, speaking truth in times of war has always been a risky business. Some will recall that a year after Martin Luther King came out against the war in Vietnam on April 4th, 1967, he was assassinated. Prior to his assassination, his organization suffered tremendously, financially and otherwise, but that didn't stop him. As he said at the time, there can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love, meaning that he thought it his patriotic duty to do what he did and speak out in times of war. But let's be very clear. In the case of our assembly and the various people from all over the world that are on this list, we have all sorts of people who are trying to speak the truth as they see it, and they must be allowed to do this. Let's take, for example, our first speaker today, Colonel Richard Black, retired, former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, and former Virginia State Senator, is a decorated Vietnam War veteran. He clearly thought that he needed to serve his country as he did. And he's now doing that again. We're beginning with a presentation that he's prepared for today. Did US/NATO blow up the Nordstream pipelines?
I think most of you are familiar with me by now. I'm Senator Dick Black of Virginia, and I'm retired colonel. I fought in Vietnam in very, very bloody combat. I was wounded in Vietnam, and then later I was a JAG officer. Finally, served in the Pentagon, where I advised the Senate Armed Services Committee. I testified before Congress and had my division prepare the executive orders that went to the President of the United States. I have a background. I'm a patriot. I've risked my life hundreds of times for the country, but I am very concerned about the direction of American foreign policy. What I want to talk to you about this morning is something that was very dramatic that just recently occurred, and that was the explosive detonations that destroyed the Nordstream 1 and 2. There are only a few nations that have the means of carrying out a military strike of this technical complexity. Now, I was a career prosecutor, and so I looked at these things from the eyes of a prosecutor. You look at motive, means, and opportunity. So you said, well, who had the means to destroy the pipeline? Now, the Ukraine does not have the means of doing it on their own, not unless somebody walked them through it. So I think you can write out the Ukraine. Now, who had motive? You had to find somebody who's got the motive. Certainly, there were nations that did have the motive. Poland, for example, might be one. But there was no nation that had a clearer motive to destroy the pipelines than the United States. Only the United States had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to destroy this vital infrastructure. President Biden publicly declared his intention to destroy Nord Stream 2 back on February 7th. He was speaking at a joint news conference with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Biden said, and I quote, "If Russia invades, again, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it." Now, the reporter was a little bit startled by this revelation. And she asked incredulously, she said, "But how will you do that exactly since the project is in Germany's control?" And Biden responded, "I promise you, we will be able to do it." This was quite a shocking thing to say, that even though it was a German pipeline, Germany being probably our closest ally, military ally in the world, and here's Biden saying we're going to destroy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and you have the chancellor, the head of the nation that has spent many years and fortunes to construct this thing, which will have an incredibly positive impact on the nation of Germany. And yet he's standing there silent as President Biden is saying, in effect, that if Russia comes across the border, that he will destroy Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So in law, a comment like the one made by President Biden is what is known as a party admission. It's admissible in evidence as a party admission in a trial. So we have an admission from the president, we have the opportunity, we have the means, we have an incredibly strong motive. Now, there are other nations that did have motive, as I mentioned, Poland, but the way that NATO operates without prior approval from the United States, there is no nation in NATO that would move forward with an attack that would have such profound ramifications on Europe. Remember, NATO is essentially a creation of the United States. The organization is peppered by American top officials, and even the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, is always an American. So I do not believe that any nation would carry out an attack of this sort without the prior permission of the United States. So in conclusion with that, we have no explicit proof, no admission other than the president's own comments. But I just look at the likelihood. I've dealt with thousands of criminal cases, and typically you'll call in criminal investigation division, the police, the FBI, the British bobbies, and you review the evidence. And I would often comment, because I would have these gathered around me, and I'd say, okay, looking at this, I've got a hunch this is where we need to look. And in most cases, I was correct. In this case, my hunch is the United States did it. The motive for it is quite clear. And what's happening right now in Europe is that the European people have never really been consulted about the idea of sanctions on Russian products. Now, when you sanction Russian products, you're cutting off the market for Russia, of course, but in the process, you're cutting off all of the vital natural resources coming into Europe, and you're destroying the economy of Europe. So what's happening today is that as winter approaches and there's a greater and greater demand for Russian natural gas, the people of Europe are becoming very restless. There are populist movements springing up in Sweden, in Italy, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and in Germany. And I think that one of the objectives for the U.S. was that these protest movements are placing greater and greater pressure on the countries of Europe to back off from the sanctions. And I think quite logically, it may have been one U.S. objective to say, let's just destroy the pipelines, and that way the European people can rant and rave as long as they want. But if they say turn on the pipeline and restore the gas, it can't be done. And so it takes some of the steam out of the protest movements. Now, anybody who thinks the CIA would not do something of this nature simply does not understand the CIA. They don't function in the best interest of the American people. Their aim is to serve the boys from Davos, as I call them, groups like the World Economic Forum and all the other globalist organizations that are linked together and have enormous profits at stake in these wars. By breaking up Ukraine, by creating the war situation and knocking the socks off of the Ukrainian economy through the war, they're in the process right now of rushing in to buy up state-owned properties of Ukraine and buying them up at a nickel on the dollar. The Ukrainian people are impoverished. Outside globalists, oligarchs have the money. They're buying things on a fire sale. They want to do the same thing with Russia. And so I am most uneasy that the Central Intelligence Agency, DOD, and the State Department have coordinated to destroy those pipelines. Like I say, that's speculation, but I think it's a pretty good guess. As winter approaches, the people of Europe are beginning to wake up. And I hope that they realize they've been taken on a wild venture that is not only murderous for the Ukrainian and the Russian people, but it's suicidal for at least the economy of Europe. And I hope that the American people will also begin to recognize that, like so many of these military endeavors, this was a setup from the beginning. Yes, the Russians did attack, but the war had been planned for many years and had been going on 7 years before the Russians ever crossed the border. So I think there's going to be a lot of news that will come out of Europe over the winter. And I hope perhaps the Europeans will wake up and say, we're finished with this. We don't need war. We're risking a nuclear war. And it is time to restore some sanity in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Colonel Black. Now, our next speaker is now public enemy number one on the latest version of the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation list. But there's a date associated also for her and for those of us who've known her for so many years. On this day, October 6th, back 36 years ago in 1986, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, 400 federal, state, and local law enforcement personnel descended on her home at that time with Lyndon LaRouche in what was described at the time as an attempted assassination attempt against him. Needless to say, he and she both survived that, but they did not survive the prosecution that began after that, which former Attorney General Ramsey Clark described back in 1993 as what he called a broader range of deliberate and systematic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge. So we have she's sort of a double threat. And for those that might be so credulous as to assume that the fact that a New York Times story appears and asserts that the United States knew nothing about what might be being done by the Ukrainian authorities, the kind of injustice and precedent for injustice that Colonel Black already discussed and that we know very well as a result of many things, including things like the illegal war in Iraq, 2003, mean that there's a greater investigation. Speaking truth in time of war and truth to power has been something that she's done her entire life. Let me also indicate that as the founder of the Schiller Institute, she's been sponsoring conferences around what's called a new security and development architecture, which includes, in fact, insisting that the war in Ukraine must come to an end, that Ukraine should not be a member of NATO, and so forth. And I guess that's more than enough to say about why she's both qualified to speak to the question of the list, the question of Europe, and the question of injustice in our time. So it's always my honor to introduce Helga Sepp-LaRouche. Helga, you have the floor.
Yes, hello, thank you. Well, I had the good prescience when we moved in Leesburg into a new farmhouse that I insisted that it should be called Ibicus and Ibicus Farm. And this is a reference to the poem by Friedrich Schiller, The Cranes of Ibicus, which I can only advise people to read because it is a poem which reminds people that there is a higher force of justice, sometimes called nemesis, sometimes called natural law. And I believe that the Ibicus principle is operating and eventually will bring the culprits to justice. Now, given the fact that today is this memorable, not so nice, but memorable day of the 36th anniversary of the raid, I just want to recall it because, you know, when you wake up 6:45 in the morning by the deafening noise of a helicopter flying around your bedroom window, because that's what happened. And then we naturally jumped out of the bed and looked what was going on. And we discovered very quickly that there were these 400 FBI agents, armored vehicles, and police, dogs, armed people. 400 people. This was clearly designed to cause us to react in any way, to then have a pretext to get rid of us. Now we were able to stop that by, on the one side, calling up the White House. There was clearly an intervention from higher people than those who had ordered this FBI raid, which stopped it. So we managed not to be killed at this moment. But this was a really profound experience, and I must say that ever since, my naive belief in democracy and the rule-based order, if I ever had such a belief, such a naive belief, was somewhat shattered. Because what was the crime? My husband, Lyndon LaRouche, he was the most law-abiding, peaceful, loving, creative person you can imagine. And what was his crime? He reacted to the middle-range missile crisis at the beginning of the 80s, which was the period when you had in Europe hundreds of thousands of people in the street because you had the Pershing II and the SS-20 directed against each other with only a few minutes, 5, 6, 7 minutes launch time, a flight time, and all these missile systems were all the time launch on warning. Helmut Schmidt at that time was absolutely convinced that we were on the verge of World War III, and all the people in the streets as well. So my husband had designed something which is up to the present day the most advanced design for a new international security architecture, which was basically a proposal to the Soviet Union that the United States and the Soviets together would work on new technologies based on new physical principles, which would be implemented together and make these nuclear weapons together obsolete. This was a very, very far-sighted proposal to overcome the blocks. We were in back-channel discussions with the Soviets for 1 full year. So it was a very serious proposition, and President Reagan on the 23rd of March declared it to be the official US policy. When the Soviets rejected it, because the Olgakov faction in the Soviet Union had completely different plans, then all hell broke loose, because the relevant neocons in the Reagan administration also went into a rampage. And that was the crime, that my husband had proposed something which would have completely changed the geopolitical blocks of the post-war period. And he predicted in 84, when it was clear that the Soviets rejected this proposal, he predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse in 5 years if they would stick to their policies. So that was the background of this raid, because the idea that you would dare to have an idea to change the established geopolitical order, was just too much. And then my husband had proposed another thing. This was a prognosis in 71, when Nixon went to the floating exchange rates by dismantling the old Bretton Woods system. He had predicted at that time that if one would continue on this monetarist track, it would necessarily come to a new depression, a new fascism, and a new danger of a world war. And that's exactly where we are today. When even the European Central Bank is putting out end of September a warning that we are in a very severe systemic crisis, and we are about to see an explosion of a hyperinflationary collapse of the transatlantic system, then that prognosis of my husband is exactly turns out to have been exactly correct. Now, the parallel to today, and the reason why it was important to remember the raid, because this raid and the subsequent prosecution of my husband, which Ramsey Clark correctly called the worst one in the history of the United States, is to the present day the reason why his name, the name of the LaRouche movement, is being slandered, and many people are supposed to be scared away from looking at the solutions, which would be, the way how to come out of this crisis. Now, when it became clear that, the negotiations would not happen, which, was clear after Boris Johnson had intervened in Ukraine in March, we called the first conference of the Schiller Institute on the 9th of April, demanding a new international security and development architecture, which would take into account the interest of every single country on the planet, being in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. And we assembled speakers. We had conferences in May, in June, July, August, and September. And more than 30 people who participated in these conferences are now on that list. Now, all we demanded was that, if you continue with the present geopolitical confrontation, with the idea that, there must be a victory on the battlefield, more and more heavy weapons, ruin Russia. Just a few days ago, the Russian ambassador in the United States, Antonov, warned, that this basically means that the US is becoming a war party and that this will have the most serious consequences. This is going to be the danger of World War III. And we were mobilizing against that by putting forward a solution, which basically would solve all these problems, to have a new security architecture, which would include Russia and China, to have an economic cooperation along the lines of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Land Bridge, which was our proposal in '91. And it would also help the Ukraine, which right now is, even before the war started, in a terrible economic crisis. So all our proposals are really solution-oriented, and they still are absolutely what needs to be put on the table. Now, what Colonel Black was referring to pertains to that, because the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, where, now we have a lot of experts speaking out. We will hear from one of them in this show. All basically say, that if you look at the cui bono, the motive, the capacity, the opportunity, all that speaks for either United States or a country under the umbrella of the United States, like the British or the Poles or, some other NATO countries, but that it is almost impossible for Russia to have done it because, as Colonel Bosshardt, who will speak shortly, points to, that, if Russia would have been able to do the sabotage in an area which is 100% controlled by NATO, it would mean a capacity of seabed warfare superiority, which would completely, shake up the entire assumptions about the so-called weak and outdated and old-fashioned Russian army defeated in Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine. It's really food for thought. So having mentioned all of these things, I think that we have reached a point where, the truth about the sabotage of Nord Stream 2 must be found. The pipelines must be repaired immediately, because right now, as a result of the sanctions, which, the German people and European people never were asked about if they agreed with that, it has backfired. Not Russia is going bankrupt. Russia has completely moved towards the east. They are now building a new system together with China, with the non-aligned movement, with the global south. the BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So Russia is doing relatively well, but Germany, Europe is about to crash against the wall. If these sanctions continue and the energy coming from the pipelines no more, means that Germany is about to be deindustrialized. And if Germany goes under, then all of Europe collapses. So this is not a joke. So the demand is to immediately start the repair of the pipelines, including Russia, because it's a Russian pipeline, immediately stopping the sanctions and going in the direction of a solution which can only be inclusive in international security and development architecture, reorganizing the bankrupt financial system, and going in the direction of mutual assured survival, and not going in the direction of World War III. So this is a serious matter, and we want to have the widest discussion about these ideas as possible.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Helga. And for those of you who've just joined us, we want to welcome you to our event today. We will not be silenced, speaking truth in times of war. You just heard from Helga Sepp-LaBrouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute. And a little earlier, we heard from Colonel Richard Black, retired former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon and former Virginia State Senator. Now, our next speaker is Eva Bartlett, who I believe is with us. I know we're having a little problem there. I think she's there. She is an American-Canadian activist, commentator, blogger, and she is a wartime correspondent, from what I understand. I think she's actually on scene, and she's going to tell us all about that. So Eva, if you're there, we've got you. Okay, I see you there. Great. So welcome, and you have the floor.
There we go. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for having me participate in this panel. I apologize for being a bit late. It's not easy to be on time sometimes here. I'm in Donetsk. I came back here on September 17th. And at the very moment I was arriving into the city, midday, Ukraine was shelling central Donetsk. Ukraine's shelling that day with 155 millimeter NATO caliber weapons killed 4 civilians, one of whom was still lying on the ground when I got to the area where she had been murdered. 2 days later, on September 19th, Ukraine shelled different areas of central Donetsk, killing 16 civilians. I went to one of the areas where it was a massacre. There was 9 people killed in that one spot. Their bodies were still in the ground. Pieces of bodies were strewn down the street. It was a horrific sight. 3 days later, Ukraine shelled again central Donetsk, this time near a busy central market, also on a street with a streetcar, with public transportation, pedestrians, a church in the other direction. That shelling killed 6 civilians. Again, their bodies were still on the ground at the time that I arrived, about 30 minutes after the shelling. These were all completely civilian areas of Donetsk. They were not military targets. This is not the first time, of course, we know that Ukraine has been shelling central Donetsk. They were doing so in August when I was here. They were doing so in June when I was here. And Donetsk civilians are being terrorized. I was just actually, the reason I'm a little bit late is I was meeting with a journalist I know who I worked with in 2019. And he was explaining to me, because I wanted to know, not being a weapons expert of any sort, I wanted to clarify, like, look, is there any legal basis for what Ukraine is doing here? He said, no. If Ukraine was actually striking a military target and there were civilians who were injured or wounded in Ukraine's doing so, then that would be a different issue. But when Ukraine fires like 5, 7, 10 shells into the center of the city, that's pure terrorism. And so, and this is continued, by the way, post-referendum. I was just looking at some notes from a local Telegram channel. October 1st, 7 people were killed in Donetsk. October 2nd, 2 people, October 3rd, 2 people, October 5th, 3 people killed. And you know, that's 14 people killed in the span of 5 days. Some days ago, around 6 p.m., Ukraine fired using the HIMARS system missiles onto central Donetsk, hitting 2 different shopping mall areas. Thankfully, as I understand, the air defense fired down the missiles, but still there was considerable damage. Nobody was killed that day, thankfully, but it could have been, of course, a lot worse. And just yesterday, I went to Gorlivka with a couple of journalists. Gorlivka is north of Donetsk. It's a very hard hit area, and especially the villages around Gorlivka, they've been shelled relentlessly for over 8 years. I had gone to one of them in 2019, and I went back there yesterday. Basically, and again, what I was told by the journalist that I was with today, what I saw, the remains of the houses that I saw in 2019, most of that has been destroyed by this point. So I went to the administrative building of Gorlivka and talked with the head of that village to hear about the Ukraine's continued shelling. And I didn't go beyond. In 2019, I went beyond that administrative building. I saw houses, some were still standing, most were in states of utter disuse, roofs blown off, walls blown out. One was still smoldering from having been shelled 2 days prior. This time I wasn't able to get there because it was too dangerous to go there. I did go to another village, tried to interview people there. Most of the people were moving quickly through the town center not because they were afraid to be interviewed. Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes people fear reprisals if they are interviewed by foreign media. In this case, I was told they feared sticking around the town center because Ukraine's shelling was so frequent. And I drove around that town and saw quite a lot of destruction. Most of the people I saw who were still there were elderly. In my experience, elderly either don't have anywhere to go, don't have the means to go anywhere, or don't want to leave their homes. So they are being terrorized by Ukraine's shelling. One man was standing on his balcony and he pointed to the fact that his windows were blown out and said he had just covered them with plastic sheeting and he was going to have to endure winter with that. And that's the case in many areas of the Donbass, which have been affected by Ukraine's shelling. I don't know how much I can address in terms of like repercussions for being observers of the referendum because I haven't left here yet. I have not received any sort of emails, as I'm aware that colleagues who came here to be observers of the referendum have received being threatened with some sort of sanctions or otherwise. I have not myself received that. I do expect, being both a citizen of the US and Canada, that I probably will. But I just want to state from the perspective of someone that was here prior to, during, and after the referendum, in terms of how the media has covered that, and I'm sure maybe this has already been discussed. I apologize if I'm making a repeated point, but we all know, I think most of us on this panel know, that the referendum was held in a very democratic and free manner. Perhaps not the most ideal in terms of, like, there wasn't always 100% privacy, but frankly, people here didn't care because it was well known what they wanted, and that was to join Russia. I was going around to different areas of Donetsk, including Kievsky, which is a very hard-hit area, repeatedly shelled on an almost daily basis by Ukraine. I went to Kirovsky, same situation, in this one in Western Donetsk. I went to Gorlivka and I went to Mariupol. This is during the 5 days of the referendum. I saw volunteers from the voting commission going door to door, and I'm aware of how Western media is construing there's a beep there. I'm aware how Western media is portraying things as people having had a gun pointed at their head. That was not the case. There were local soldiers providing security, but nobody was intimidated by them. I started asking people, is anyone coercing you to vote? And they would laugh and they'd say, no, we've been waiting for this for over 8 years. So frankly, the way Western media is, it's not surprising the way they've been reporting on the referendum. But in my experience, people here were overjoyed that the referendum finally came about, and they're overjoyed with the results of the referendum. I did conduct interviews the day after the referendum just to follow up and see, ask more of the same questions. One of the things they would say when I'd say, like, what do you expect having joined Russia? They'd say peace. That's their overriding will, is peace. They want an end to Ukraine's shelling. And they also hope for some sort of economic stability, but peace was the overriding issue. And I guess just one other point I want to make, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to prepare a speech. I didn't have much time to do much of anything. one other point I do want to emphasize is that whereas if we're following some of the comments coming from people holding extremist views in Ukraine and how they view people here in the Donbass as subhuman, as expendable, as people they can kill, when I talk to people here, most people refer to Ukrainians as their brothers and sisters, and they just want an end to this war. They want to be stable. They want, they want their rights as Russian speakers, but they're not calling for bloodshed. They're not calling for more deaths. They just want peace and stability. And it's really a shame, again, not surprising that Western media won't air this, but it is a shame how dehumanized people here have been, and how their entire narrative has been disappeared from the media's reporting on things here. The media implying things only started in February, when we all know it started in 2014. And they've paid very dearly here for not wanting what happened in Kiev and Odessa to come to them here. They're some of the most humane people I've met, very kind, very well informed. They have no disillusions about what's happening here. And when I ask the question, because I know the way the media is spinning things, do you feel like Russia invaded here? One man's reaction was like, how can Russia invade when we wanted to join Russia? And so there's such I don't blame people in the West for not understanding what's happening on the ground here, because simply there are very few Western reporters that will come here. They do exist. Any of the Western media that I have seen here, and I've only seen in March, 2 French media channels, they were presented with the same information that we are presented with, but they chose not to report on it. So it's on their hands, the fact that they haven't reported the truth. I know they have directives, but I'm very happy to be here and to be able to share my experiences with you and with people who read my work or follow what I have to say on social media, on my Telegram channels and on YouTube. So again, I'm sorry I didn't have time to prepare anything. If anyone has a question now or later, I'd be happy to address that.
Well, thank you very much, Eva, and we very much appreciate that you did get on, and despite the fact that you had no time to prepare, I think we all were very prepared to respond to that message. If you've just joined us, you are watching the EIR event. We will not be silenced. Speaking truth in times of war. You've just heard from Eva Bartlett, an American-Canadian journalist, speaking to us from Donetsk, and she just spoke truth in time of war. Our next, and we will be getting to questions. Let me just also say, because that may be of importance to people who are here, we're going to try to get through as quickly as possible with a few of the presentations, and then come right back to questions and also cross discussion among the panelists. The next speaker is Dr. Cliff Kirikoff, former senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Now, actually, he's on his way to Capitol Hill right now because he's doing some lobbying up there to try to see if he can bolster what is emerging as a kind of small but important response from only a few congressmen, like Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona and a couple of others. And so he prepared a message which we're going to play right now.
Good morning. My name is Clifford Kirikoff. I served on the staff of the Senate of the United States from 1981 to 1992, including several years on the Committee on Foreign Relations as a senior professional staff member. I'm now a retired academic, having taught at the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College many years ago, and more recently at Virginia Military Institute and Washington and Lee University over the last 2 decades. The US and NATO proxy war in the Ukraine involves widespread information operations as part of the combined arms military operations, as well as operations including psychological and political warfare to support the Ukraine regime and its present Western-sponsored post-2014 Maidan coup Nazi regime. The creation of notorious blacklists by the Ukraine regime now includes American citizens. For example, a seated senator of the United States here in Congress, as well as former US government officials including some from the Central Intelligence Agency. Although retired and not politically active at all, my name appears on the CCD list. The US government and its financial, military, and intelligence support directly and indirectly sustains and influences the information operations of the Ukraine. In turn, now American citizens are placed on the black lists of the Nazi regime in Ukraine. This presents a direct challenge and threat to the First Amendment of our Constitution and our rights under the Constitution as American citizens. Entering the Senate of the United States, I was sworn to defend our Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Congress passed the Smith-Mundt Act of 1947 that was originally designed to protect Americans from the propaganda our government broadcast abroad during the Cold War. Washington's foreign propaganda was not to be directed against the American people. My recommendations at present are: 1, members of Congress should task the General Accountability Office, GAO, for a full investigation of US funds spent in the Ukraine. Such an investigation would include US funds supporting intelligence and information operations of the Ukraine. 2, members of Congress should task the Library of Congress, Congressional Research Service, CRS, for a full investigation of Nazi and neo-Nazi political ideology and activity in the Ukraine. What are its origins? Who are involved in its origins, and who are actively promoting this in the Ukraine today? This investigation would include the eugenics and racial anthropology research in the Ukraine during the 1920s and 1930s, which preceded the rise of Stepan Bandera and other extremists associated with the German Nazi regime. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we can all do something about this problem here in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kirikoff. And if you've just joined us, you are watching We Will Not Be Silenced, Speaking the Truth in Times of War, sponsored by Executive Intelligence Review. You've just heard from Dr. Cliff Kirikoff, former senior staff member of U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he's also the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. We're now going to hear from Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Broussard, retired from the Swiss Army. Besides what we're about to hear, he is also an author. He wrote an article recently called "Sabotage of the Nordstream Gas Pipelines for Once the Question Cui Bono is Not Sufficient." Let's hear now from Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Broussard.
Being new here, I wish to say a few words about myself first. I've been serving 25 years in the Swiss Armed Forces, participated in an exchange program with the British Army, attended many courses and exercises with NATO forces, completed a 1.5-year training course at the Military Academy of the Russian General Staff in Moscow, and served within the framework of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. I lived and worked in Eastern Ukraine and traveled several times to Nagorno-Karabakh. In the light of current speculation about the responsibility of the sabotage attack on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 natural gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, it may be good to rely on the facts known so far. Only the time and place of the events which have been anonymously identified as an act of sabotage are uncontested. Of course, there is currently no evidence of responsibility by either side, and a truly independent investigation will probably never take place, as so often before. I think that most of us agree that state actors must have been at work here. The destruction of an offshore pipeline made of high-quality alloys covered with rubble or sand at a depth of 70 to 90 meters, 20 kilometers off the coast is not for amateur divers. For professional divers, however, diving depths of 70 to 90 meters are not a problem, so there's a good chance that information on the kind of damage inflicted can be obtained in the coming weeks. Whoever destroyed the natural gas pipelines must expect that evidence will literally come to light rather soon. The robust construction and difficult accessibility of natural gas pipelines in general, even on land, means that operators and authorities of the country usually refrain from monitoring entire pipelines. In Switzerland's Armed Forces Command Staff, for instance, we thought about such scenarios and came to the conclusion that an attack on infrastructure and gas supply above the ground would be much easier. On the other side, the water depths mentioned are a strong argument against the use of submarines to prepare the blast because, as I was told in the Academy of the General Staff in Moscow, large submarines prefer to operate in much deeper waters, especially when it comes to presumably well-monitored waters like the Baltic Sea. The use of an unmanned underwater vehicle is surely the more plausible version. It is true, if it is true that the Russian Navy carried out a large-scale sabotage operation in the middle of a sea area surrounded by NATO countries and candidates, 300 kilometers from their nearest naval base, then the Russians would have made a real show of NATO. This would have been an impressive demonstration of Russian seabed warfare capabilities. The mere destruction of Nordstream 1 and 2 would have been much easier for them on their own doorstep in the Gulf of Finland, for instance. It would have been much easier for NATO compared to this to destroy the Nord Stream pipelines. As recently as June, the US Sixth Fleet, together with its NATO partners, conducted exercises just off Bornholm, in which unmanned underwater vehicles were tested as well. The exercise Baltops 22 could have been used as a test run or as a camouflage for the installation of explosive device on the natural gas pipelines. If, however, the Russian Navy succeeded in overcoming all the technical and tactical obstacles and approached the scene of the sabotage act undetected, maybe carried out extensive preparatory work there, triggered the detonation, and departed again undetected, alarm bells should be ringing in Western capitals. In this case, almost every underwater infrastructure of Western European countries would have been under threat, including the gas pipeline Baltic Pipe, which was opened a few days ago only, but also all underwater cables for communication, as well as numerous lines for electricity. This would then massively revise the image of the allegedly incompetent Russian armed forces that Western sources have been so fond of spreading in recent months, and at the same time reflect badly on the naval forces of the NATO countries involved. Currently, I'm asking myself whether we are on the eve of an unprecedented wave of sabotage against the offshore infrastructure on the edge of Europe, cutting off the continent from gas and telecommunications. With that in mind, I can only hope that Western forces destroyed the Nord Stream 1 and 2, because I don't really want to think about the consequences of a wave of Russian sabotage against our offshore infrastructure. With that said, I can end the statement here.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Bossard. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to our event. We will not be silenced, speaking truth in times of war. You've just heard Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Bossard of the Swiss Army discussing the issue of the Nord Stream line. Our next speaker, who was previously #1 on the list, I think he was dropped to #2, is Graham Fuller. Some people know him. He's the vice chair of the formerly vice chair of the National Intelligence Council, served as station chief for the CIA in Kabul. So he's sort of a notorious character who has nonetheless been at least temporarily demoted to number 2 on the kill list for us today. But the idea is to let Mr. Fuller both respond to and tell us what he's got to say. He's a veteran of these kinds of wars, and I think he will be able to give us an insight that a lot of people wouldn't otherwise have. So, Graham, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to talk to you today. Clearly, this is a major tragedy in, at least in the West, probably extending to much of the world, as this foolish and dangerous war in Ukraine, proxy war in Ukraine, advances. I think the damage of this war is becoming clearer all the time and expanding all the time, simply because unknown, unpredictable elements are ever more coming to the surface. First of all, I think I would say, and I think many people might agree, this is a war that did not have to be. When we consider that there were discussions and negotiations for Minsk II negotiations about how to possibly settle the Donbas crisis. Ultimately, this settlement, this negotiated settlement and diplomatic settlement was rejected by both Ukraine and Washington. Now, apart from the terrible loss of human life that we witnessed both on the Russian side and even more powerfully on the Ukrainian side, I wonder really what is being gained by all of this and what is being lost. I'm particularly struck, apart from the loss, excuse me, loss of lives, by the gross corruption of Western media, and indeed much of global media, in covering a crisis like this Ukraine war. We've just heard earlier from a correspondent on the scene talking about incidents that we really have almost no awareness of as we sit here in the West trying to understand what is going on. I would argue that as an old intelligence officer, I really struggle to try to understand what exactly is happening on the battlefield. Forget about the New York Times, forget about the Washington Post, forget about most American media, and sadly, forget about now much of even West European media, such as the Guardian, which I've always regarded as a fairly balanced and neutral source of information. We now find I hate to say it, but a masterful orchestration by Washington of international media. One needs to speculate as to why such a masterful orchestration of international media could take place. I think one quite obvious reason, several obvious reasons, but one is the degree of corporatization of Western media, in which most corporations, major media, are very unwilling to buck the trend of what the mainstream lines of American policy are. So I think this is probably one of the most major casualties of this war, apart from the terrible human tragedy. Secondly, in my entire experience as a CIA operations officer, and I speak Russian fluently, I've dealt with Russians, Soviets more to the point, back in the day. I have never seen such a vilification of Russia, not only Russia, but of Russian culture, Russian people, Russian arts, anything related to Russia that has been simply vilified for purposes of this propaganda campaign in the war. This is indeed an information war, but it is very hard to hear what the other side is saying, including even the Russian media, which is rarely ever covered in the West. I think we're talking about here also a mastery of spin and censorship of news, that any news that runs contrary to the established narrative as the United States seeks to present it. And now, worst of all, we see intimidation of those few alternative voices, many of whom are represented here at this meeting today. Intimidation of these voices from speaking out with an alternative view. I don't want to say that this is an open and shut situation of good and evil on either side in the war in the Ukraine. Both sides have their cases to be made, and they need to be examined. But the problem is that anybody who attempts to address these problems in a balanced fashion is largely silenced. If not actually silenced, at least they can find very few media, very few outlets which will cover alternative views of this crisis. I think this is extremely damaging to the future of the integrity of Western media and indeed global media as we move into the years ahead, when manipulation of information, we already know about this on things like Facebook and Twitter, but when manipulation of information by major governments really represents half the war underway. We also are now aware that the blacklist that has been created by the Ukrainian government, the so-called Center for Countering Disinformation, is part of the major support lent by Washington and by the State Department in particular. I don't know about intelligence sides. It's hard to imagine they are not involved. But in any case, in the mere preparation of a blacklist, which includes large numbers of Americans who have served in the military or served in intelligence organizations or other kinds of major governmental organizations. These are the people who are being now blacklisted in, I think, quite shocking ways. More shocking is the fact that the United States government so far does not seem to feel it is necessary to respond to this, to pull the Ukrainians back from this kind of attack on American citizens. I would finally just like to say about the more general damage of this war, as I say, apart from the human damage or even the information warfare damage, I think we are now witnessing a massive geopolitical shift with unknown consequences down into the next several decades. This geopolitical shift essentially means the exclusion of Russia from any kind of dealings with Europe, and essentially suggesting that Russia's future lies solely in Asia. We already see that well underway with close cooperation and shared strategic interests with China. Those interests are now being augmented by the creation of organizations like the BRICS states and the emergence increasingly of the global South, which finds it does not have an interest in this conflict, and indeed views it as a fundamentally white man's European conflict, it may be an extension of the former Cold War. So the world is beginning to divide up into blocks which we have not seen since the Cold War. But I think it will prove to be extremely damaging in the long run. I think much of the brunt of this tragedy, of this upcoming disaster, is going to lie particularly on European states, because they have now, through US NATO policy, and let's remember the EU policy, this is an important issue. EU policy, foreign policy, is fundamentally NATO. There is no alternative European foreign policy. It all comes through the voice of NATO. Europeans have now been compelled to close down virtually all trade of any kind through these sanctions with Russia. And the United States is indeed now pressing very heavily for similar kinds of depression of any trade between Europe and China, and urging that Europe indeed join an anti-China coalition as well. So I think Europe, sadly, is going to suffer most of all from this conflict. We can clearly see that coming in the winter months, in which oil and gas will not be available to the Europeans. We have now this pipeline incident, which several of our speakers have already talked about. In other words, it's a grim prognosis for Europe, and possibly the collapse of European economies and the deindustrialization of major states like Germany. One wonders what it will take for European states to decide that this cost is too high, too damaging, too socially damaging. Already we have seen a sharp shift to the right within many European states in their elections, in Britain, in Poland, Hungary, in Italy, and elsewhere. This will greatly increase as the hardships of the winter, and indeed the wisdom of the present leadership of much of European countries is brought into challenge as to why they have chosen to follow this path, in which essentially Europe is the primary victim of the effects of it. So I fear we are moving into a really new kind of global formation of new blocks of power, which will not help the world in any way. It will be very damaging and destructive to a global economy, and really will end up with a dividing line between East and West, Russia on one side and EU on the other. But essentially, the powerful emergence of Asia under projects like the Chinese Belt and Road, which is going to already is exercising major economic influence around the region. And I think Europe will find itself potentially excluded from all these huge benefits of linking trade patterns between East Asia and Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. And if you've just joined us, you've just heard Graham Fuller, former vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council and also former station chief in Kabul for the CIA. And he's speaking on today's forum, which is "We Will Not Be Silenced, Speaking Truth in Times of War." What we're going to do is we have a few things. People have been asking about questions. We are going to be getting the questions. If you have questions, you want to submit them, there are various ways to do that. I'm not going to stop to identify that at the moment because we're going to keep things moving. We want to hear now from Diane Sayer, who is an independent candidate for the United States Senate in New York, who's also on the blacklist. Recently did a trip in Europe and has some insight not only from that, but in general, the situation on the ground in the United States. And then after that, I want to just say that Colonel Black may have to get going. We'll probably give him a moment to give us any reflections after that, and then resume our program. So, Diane?
Yes, thank you very much. I presume I can be heard okay?
Yes, you're good.
Good. So my remarks really are sort of a warning or something that people like King Charles, the GCHQ, the misnamed American intelligence community, and European leaders might want to bear in mind. You talked before about the principle of nemesis. I would speak about something LaRouche warned about frequently, the linear deductive thinking. And to give an example of that, you can think of a fellow who jumps off a 100-story building, whose intent is to see how quickly he can move. And at the 98th floor, he's going a certain speed, and the 75th floor, he's going another faster, and at the 20th floor, it's really going great, and he's very excited that he surely is going to be able to accelerate into infinity. But when he gets to the first floor, something different occurs. That is, there's a singularity, there's a change in the space, and he has an end which is not exactly what he intended at the beginning. And I'll give another example, a little bit different. Helga may remember this some years ago. I think it was Mercedes that was trying to save some money on doing test drives. So they used a computer model to design a special discounted type of automobile. And the computer model said that the new steering system was absolutely fine. But when they put the car on the road, it turned out that it overturned if you tried to turn a corner going more than 40 miles an hour. Now, why am I saying this? Because you have people who have unleashed what they consider to be one kind of process on the planet, but could very well evolve to something else. And we've seen many examples. People already have spoken about the backfiring of the sanctions that were supposed to crush and destroy Russia have not hurt Russia nearly as much as they've hurt the West. And in fact, they've propelled nations into working to establish a new order along the lines of what the Schiller Institute had been fighting for many years. We had what Dennis Speed began with, which I think is very interesting. I don't know what it signifies, but the fact that the New York Times has had to cover American officials saying that they did not authorize or support the assassination of Daria Dugina, and that they believe that a faction in the Ukrainian government was responsible for it, I would say indicates another kind of shift. Then we have the announcement by OPEC that they're going to cut production of petroleum by 2 million barrels per day, which has Biden very upset, and he calls it very short-sighted, but perhaps he is very short-sighted in his policy. So I'm raising these things not to say that we are going to win this fight to get mankind safely through this and out on the other side with a new security and development architecture, as Helga has so eloquently called for now for so many years. But to say that there are so many factors involved in what is being discussed that you could equally well plunge into nuclear annihilation as you could end up with something much better. And it depends very, very much on what individual people choose to do. I think it's impossible to overestimate the power of speaking the truth in a moment like this, because you don't know which ears your words are reaching. there's a certain dynamic. It's occurred to me to wonder if all the people in Europe are going to be so thrilled to be without heat and electricity in a very cold winter, and if they appreciate that their governments have had very little to say about the destruction of Nord Stream 1 and 2. And I'll just close by saying that human beings have an ability to actually know, to forecast. Lyndon LaRouche was a genius at this science of imagining in your mind the various possibilities. We can do it much more efficiently than a computer. We are much more accurate than the Mercedes benchmarking process. Another such individual was Albert Einstein, who conducted experiments on the speed of light, accepting we don't have anything that you can put in a laboratory except light itself that goes at the speed of light. But he was talking about trains going at the speed of light and things like that. And the hypotheses that he developed turned out many years later to be absolutely accurate. So what I wanted to contribute to this discussion today is the urgency of everyone acting in the interest of the good of mankind, because I think there is a universal principle of natural law, and I think we are seeing some glimmers of a response to our action. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. And if you've just joined us, you're watching We Will Not Be Silenced, Speaking Truth in Times of War. You just heard from Diane Sayer. She's an independent candidate for the United States Senate in New York, and is also another person on the kill list. Actually, I think everyone we've heard from, it, just to clarify for people that have never maybe been on a forum like this, been in this sort of environment, everyone that has spoken, I believe with the possible exception of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Bassard, is on the list. I'm not sure whether he's on the list, but he may be on the list by the end of the program. So what we're going to do now is give Lieutenant Colonel Black a chance to say something, because his schedule is such that he's got to get moving, got to get going. If he has any responses to what he's heard, and of course, Colonel Black, let me just say, as of now, I think the video that you did 36 hours ago on the topic that people heard is now around about 300,000 views on our site. I know others are getting it around as well. So go right ahead.
Well, thank you. Let me just take sort of a global view of this thing. The question is, why war in Ukraine? Why did we create this? Now, I don't think anybody who seriously examines what has happened, it fails to recognize that the United States planned this war long ago. Certainly, in 2014, there was a final decision made that we would have a war between NATO and Russia. And we did that when we overthrew the legitimately elected government of Ukraine, headed by President Yanukovych. And immediately thereafter, we began flooding arms and building a huge Ukrainian army to make war on the Donbass, which they promptly did, began killing people. And as Eva mentioned, they have been just routinely killing people in the Donbass. It went on for 7 years before Russia ever got involved in the conflict at all. So we deliberately, knowingly forced Russia's back to the wall, knowing that they had no choice but to come into the war. Now, it's important to recognize some people have been sort of trained to believe that Russia presented a threat to Europe. They presented no threat. And the proof of this, I happened to stumble across it while I was doing some research. Germany, which at the height of the Cold War, when I was over there, they had thousands and thousands of tanks operated by the West German Army. At the time that I looked, which was before the outbreak of hostilities, I discovered that Germany only had 200 operational tanks. I mean, that's nothing that's almost completely disarmed of tanks. And so no nation is more cognizant of a threat from Russia than Germany. And it was clear from the number of tanks that they had in operation that they considered the threat of an attack from Russia at zero, at nothing. And so why a war? Well, there is a war because the globalists want a war. They've decided there's going to be a war. Just days ago, there was a massive, incredible protest in Czechoslovakia. They estimated 100,000 people. They showed photographs in the New York Times today. It was a very enthusiastic, very fired up protest, very large for a country like Czechoslovakia. And it was not the first. They had a smaller protest, big one, but smaller than this one. And so they're gaining strength there. And a member of the German parliament, who I'm well acquainted with, Herr Bystrom, who is a member of the Alternative for Deutschland party, he spoke there, and I listened to his speech. And while I'm not at all fluent in German by any means, I was able to read the captions, and I could tell. He was saying, look, he said, we have these protests rising up, these populist movements all over Europe. And he pointed to a shocking turn of events in Sweden, where the conservatives during the elections gained a great deal of power. The capture of the government in Italy by populist conservative elements. What's going on? Of course, we know France has been involved for quite a while. Hungary, when Viktor Orban, president of Hungary, was mentioned to the crowd of Czechoslovakians, the crowd went wild. They were cheering and jumping up and down. And but Herr Bystrom said, our war is against globalism. And he says, we are fighting for God, for country, for sovereignty. And you could tell it was a common theme. People do not want to be part of the New World Order that was declared long ago. It was declared by Herbert Walker Bush. And again, it was declared by President Biden. Globalism ultimately leads us to one state-dictated religion. They'll combine Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism and Islam all together into sort of a pablum that they'll feed to the people as demands, and they'll change the religion and update it periodically. So they'll do away with all of the religion. They'll censor speech, which they're doing increasingly. They censored the president of the United States on Twitter, for crying out loud. They blocked the president of the United States from speaking to the people. This is going on under the direction, the guidance of the globalists. They're looking for a global dictatorship. And I tell you, sovereign nations are crucial to freedom. The further power moves away from the people, the less voice they have. And the plan, I believe, the boys in Davos, which is my shorthand term for all the globalists, whether they're under the World Economic Forum or whether they're under all these other globalist organizations, their goal is to silence the voices of the people and to simply use the people as tools in their effort to acquire monstrous amounts of power and to be able to treat people as lumps of coal that they can simply burn in the furnace or where they can store on the shelf, whatever they want to do with humanity. It's very dangerous. They're to the point now where they are risking and recklessly risking thermonuclear war. And I think it's very important that people rise up. I'm quite encouraged by the populist movements in Europe. And the one thing that all of humanity has in common is the need to have a voice. And I think that's why you're seeing the global South is rising up against this one world order. The people of Europe are rising up against the one world order. Everybody realizes that we have got to stop this monstrous force that is gradually putting in place institutions that will eliminate all freedom forever. And so I thank you very much for what you're doing here. Appreciate the opportunity to join you today. And I encourage all of the speakers and all of the listeners to speak, to be unafraid of speaking your mind. You'd be surprised. There are a lot of people who are beginning to wake up in this country and around the world. So thank you very much, Helga. Thank you for all that you're doing, putting on the event today.
Thank you very much, Senator. And what we're going to do is the following. I see are a couple of people who have questions. I'm going to announce them. Yulia Berg and Michael Springman, questions or comments. Before we go to you, what we have is we have an important figure. I hope he's there. He's with us all of the time, and he sometimes is, I see his pictures up there. The fact that someone who has been a career officer of the CIA is able to then embrace nonviolent creative direct action and carry it out is something that is one of the more hopeful elements of what characterizes the best in the American character. He wasn't expecting me to say that. I just wanted to say that because Ray McGovern has the same role in my mind as Dick Gregory had, a certain kind of figure who like confounds everyone, but is doing it in a profound way, which then causes real questions to be asked. And so Ray is going to say a few things, and then we'll go to our questions and comments. Ray, good to see you.
Dennis, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Well, this is like old home week. What a privilege. Graham Fuller and I entered the agency at exactly the same time under President Kennedy. Dick Black is a more recent acquaintance, but he and Graham have been part of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity movement, signing some of our more recent memos. I want to say it's a particular privilege to be on with Eva Bartlett. Eva sort of personifies what the title of this is all about. Wir schweigen nicht. We will not be silent. Sophie Scholl, another incredibly courageous young woman, younger even than Eva Bartlett, and not least Helga, for arranging these things and arranging us for us to be on this wonderful list where we are vulnerable to being assassinated like some others on similar lists. Thank you, Helga. Why? Well, because Helga's arranged these kinds of seminars with people such as the ones I just mentioned, and nobody else has dared. Okay. So my hat's off to Helga as well, and the courageous women who often lead us, Eva, Sophie, and Helga. Now, I'm going to say something really politically incorrect, and I hope no one takes offense, especially those who live in Germany. But Germany is the key now. We've heard about the sabotage. We've heard about the economic difficulties. We've heard about the Germans and others getting really cold this winter. And so I'm going to ask a question here that was the question asked by a young lawyer training to be a judge in Berlin in 1933. His name was Raimund Pretzel. He went by the pen name later of Sebastian Hafner. And if you get a hold of his book, it's a diary. It was found by his son after Raimund died. It's called Defying Hitler. And I'm going to read a little bit of excerpt from this because these record what Raimund Pretzel, the young lawyer studying to be a judge in Berlin in 1933, recorded at the time. And the question, of course, is whether Chancellor Scholz and Foreign Minister Baerbock are any different from the kinds of Germans we observed, more appropriately, that Raimund Pretzel observed in 1933. What Pretzel wrote is this, I will quote in English. The sequence of events in 1933 is wholly within the natural order of psychology, and it helps to explain the inexplicable. The only thing that's missing is what in animals is called breeding. This is a solid inner kernel that cannot be shaken by external pressures and forces. It's something noble and steely, a reserve, a pride, principle, and dignity to be drawn on in the hour of trial. It is missing in us Germans. As a nation, we are soft, unreliable, without backbone. This was shown in March 1933. At the moment of truth, when other nations rise spontaneously to the occasion, the Germans collectively and limply collapsed. They yielded and capitulated and suffered a nervous breakdown. The result of this millionfold nervous breakdown is the unified nation, so to speak, ready for anything, that today, 1933, that today is the nightmare of the rest of the world. The question is, in my view, 77 years after World War II, have the Germans changed? I have been expecting them to change for decades now, in vain. Now, the gauntlet has been thrown down. Will the Germans accept what the US and UK are asking them to do? And the pipeline sabotage, of course, is key to all this and an incredibly important new element. Now, when Oliver Pretzel, Raimund's son, found his diary in Berlin, he published it with the English translation, Defying Hitler. And he wrote a little poem, or he quoted a little poem right in front of that little diary. And I want to read it to you. It's very short. It's by Peter Gunn, who wrote it in 1935. So again, this is the son of the young lawyer studying to be a judge. Peter Gunn is quoted. But first, the most important thing, what are you doing in these great times? Great, I say, for times seem great to me when each man driven half to death by the error's hate and standing in the place he's given must willy-nilly concentrate and contemplate no less a thing than his own being. A little breath, a second's wait may well suffice. You catch my meaning? End of poem. Now, I would like to transition just for a second to something that was mentioned before. I think it was Ava Bartlett saying the 155 howitzers that have been long been in the U.S. Army arsenal were shelling Russian speakers in Donetsk and Lugansk. Well, I trained on the 155 self-propelled howitzer, but not in the fall of 1962. So you do the math. Let's see, 62, 60 years ago, okay? Because there were no 155 howitzers at the Army Infantry School in Fort Benning. They were all down in Key West, ready to invade Cuba. Now, why do I mention that? Well, I mention that because that shows how quickly, how short, how close we were to starting a major war, the results of which might have precluded our being together here today. President Kennedy, when he found out belatedly that Khrushchev had sent medium-range ballistic missiles to Cuba, he saw that as an existential threat to the United States. So what did he do? Well, he did all kinds of things that were semi-legal, illegal. He put in a quarantine. Most people think that was illegal under international law. He threatened nuclear war in a way much more specific than Mr. Putin has over these last couple of months. Now, I ask you, I don't remember anybody saying, hey, President Kennedy, this is unprovoked. This is unprovoked. What are you doing here? Threatening nuclear war, doing illegal things like a quarantine. You've not been provoked. I didn't hear anybody saying that because it was provoked. Okay. Now, why do I say all this? There's a direct analogy here. And it goes back to the existential threat, okay? And the fact that countries with power do not tolerate existential threats on their borders or 90 miles away from their border or 30 miles or right on their border, as is the case now in Romania, in Poland. And it was going to go, these medium-range ballistic missiles, whether they're cruise or whether they're hypersonic, were being prepared to go into these holes created for ABMs to defend against Iran. These same holes can accommodate, with the slip of a disc overnight, they can accommodate Hamagok, Putin calls them Tomahawk, Tomahawk missiles, cruise, or hypersonic missiles when the US gets its act together and gets hypersonic missiles. So are you saying to me, you're trying to tell to me that this is not an existential threat? Warning time or time from launch to target was mentioned before. Well, on the 21st of December last year, Putin, addressing his very top military, it was part of the military state of the defense forces speech. He said, look, if these cruise missiles go into these holes in the ground that can easily accommodate them, well, then I'm faced with maybe 7 to 10 minutes time to figure out, and he didn't say it this way, figure out whether I have to blow up the rest of the world. Thank you very much. Okay. Hypersonic missiles, if they go into these holes, 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That's not enough time. Okay. So what happened? As you know, late last year, the Russians came to us and said, look, this is unacceptable. We're not going to accept this. And just a little particular that doesn't appear anywhere. Okay. Negotiations were to start on the 6th and 7th of January this year. On the 30th of December, the Kremlin made known to the White House that Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden like now, right now. And the White House was in a dither. Well, we're going to start negotiations in less than 2 weeks. Where is it? What happened? Yeah, now please. So, now, to his credit, Biden accommodated that. They got on the phone, and the readout specified that Mr. Biden, or they say Mr. Joseph Biden, said that the U.S. has no intention of emplacing offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Okay, let me say that again. The Soviet readout of this telephone conversation on the 30th of December last year said that Mr. Biden said the U.S. had no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Okay. Whoa. New Year's celebrations in Moscow are never so joyous. This was a big concession. Long story short, what happened to it? Oh, I guess he woke up the next morning and Sullivan and Blinken said, "Did you really say that?" Well, yeah, he seemed to really want me to say that. And this would be a good start for the negotiations. Blinken and Sullivan, forget about it. Now, I don't know that it exactly went down that way, but I do know that 6 weeks later, the next time they talked, Putin and Biden, on the 12th of February, the readout said there was no mention of this earlier promise not to put medium or offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that the Russians felt diddled, not for the first time, okay? So Putin looked at what was happening with the NATO-trained forces against Donetsk and Lugansk. He was in Beijing on the 4th of February, and he said to Xi Jinping, you know, I know, best friend, that you don't usually like the violation of sovereign borders, but here's what's happening. We may have to go into Ukraine. We may have to attack Ukraine. And Xi Jinping says, well, you mean after the Olympics are over, right? No, again, I wasn't a fly on the wall, but that's how it worked out. Virtually all my Chinese specialist friends said Xi Jinping would never acquiesce in the violation of the principles of Westphalia, okay? But he did. He gave him a waiver, okay? Why do I mention that? I think these two facts, diddled by the US, out of patience, and who could pick a stronger ally than China? I use that term advisedly, ally, okay? Now, that's how I think it went down, and that's what the American people don't know. And I'll just finish with this. I was up in New York for a while for our high school reunion, if you can believe it. And the fellow with whom I was staying is very, very devoted to the New York Times. And so when I showed him the report yesterday that even the CIA thinks that the Ukrainians were behind these assassination things, and then I showed him that I was number 6 on the list. Wow, moving up, McGovern, number 6 on the assassination list. He just couldn't deal with it. He just couldn't understand it. And there's nothing I could have done to persuade him. So we agreed to disagree. That's how bad it is, okay? Now, the last thing I'll say is that everything said earlier by Graham Fuller and others, Colonel Black, about the media, the media is the problem. And let me just close with, I just would say again that I compliment Helge and everybody else for trying to get through, to trying to make it possible for people to learn the truth, okay? When you learn the truth, then you can keep your freedom. I'm going to close with what I think represents the situation now in the United States and in England and elsewhere with respect to trying to learn the truth. I'm quoting from Will Rogers, an old humorist a century ago, and he said this. Pay attention, it's very brief. The problem ain't what people know. The problem is what people do know that ain't so. That's the problem. And so those who have a chance to look at us this morning or to take a look at the tape, have an outside chance of being educated in a way that say, wow, really? Did Biden really promise to do that? Well, yeah, he did. There was no denial on the part of the White House. And they'll say, well, whoa, the Germans, are they prepared to freeze to death this winter? Won't they wake up and see the obvious? I mean, Colonel Black talked eloquently about the mechanics of the explosion, and so did another speaker. But will that change the way the Germans acted in 1933? If the Germans can act as adults, then I think we can find a way out of this. But it will be a new independent stance on the part of the Europeans, who really haven't had that since the 30s, at which time they blew it. Thanks very much for listening. I look forward to handling what other questions might come my way.
Thank you very much, Ray. And it's Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst. I see we have a couple more people. By the way, you raise your hand if you have a question. We're going to get to that. We do have another schedule conflict, unfortunately. Sorry about this, but Helga's going to have to get going, and we're going to ask if she has any summary remarks to make. We will be staying, and others will be answering questions. But Helga, if you're there, I don't see up on my screen right now, but that's they are. So please go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you, Ray, that you said what you just did, namely that the key is Germany right now. And that happens to be what I also think. I mean, the problem is obviously that we are still an occupied country, that we have no sovereignty. I think that when Brzezinski several decades ago said that all of Europe is just a colony, he was unfortunately right. I remember that I think it was de Villepin, if I'm not mistaken, the French foreign minister at the time, called in all the French ambassadors from all over the world to discuss this outrageous statement. But, nothing has changed to the better. So, one of the speechwriters of President Trump, I think his name is Beatty, just a couple of days ago said in a interview that the behavior of the Europeans at this point in respect to Russia doing what is demanded from them, from the United States and Great Britain in particular, means they're just behaving like despicable vessels. And I must say, I personally think this present government we have is the worst we ever had in the entire post-war period. I mean, they are bungling, they are incompetent, they are so ideologically motivated that they are about to crash the German economy against the wall. That Scholz, the chancellor, was standing on February 7th in this press conference in the White House on the side of Biden when Biden said, that they will end the Nord Stream 2. And then when a reporter asked, but this is a German project, how do you want to do it? Biden just declared, we will end it. And Scholz didn't say a mumbling word. I mean, what a chancellor is that? When he came into office, he swore an oath that he would work for the good of the German people and protect them from damage. He has done nothing of that sort. So I think, we are really reaching a critical point because, if people understand what is happening, there are some ulterior motives in this whole thing. And I think my late husband always would point to that it's not even the US government or the British government. These are, replaceable, expendable figures, as you can now see by this unfortunate woman, Liz Truss, who was talking about, oh, sure, pushing the nuclear button is one of the tasks of the prime minister, and I'm quite prepared to do it. This woman is now practically out and discredited after a few weeks only. So it's not the governments. What Lyndon LaRouche always pointed to is the fact that there is behind the scenes an oligarchy, Venetian-based, or in the tradition of the Venetian Empire, the British Empire, an oligarchy, which nowadays is a financial oligarchy, who are the ones who are making these decisions. And from these layers came the order to ruin Russia, and Baerbock repeated it many times that she wants to ruin Russia. But now it turns out that they also want to ruin Europe. They want to ruin Germany. And, I can tell you the situation here in Germany is extremely dramatic, because if this is not changed in the short term, meaning to repair the Nord Stream 2, which probably will take several months, I would assume, and make an agreement with Russia to, make sure that there is some replacement in some form. You can always redirect pipelines somehow. You can make it LNG. I don't have the technical solution right now, but get an agreement, stop the sanctions, get back to the negotiation table. And if that is not done, Germany will explode in the next weeks. Because, if you are for example, the several CEOs from the chemical industry and other energy-intensive energies just came out and said that the existence of Germany as an industrial state is at stake. Now, that means thousands and hundreds of thousands of job losses, bankruptcies of SMEs, small and medium industries, and social chaos. So I can only say, Ray McGovern, I agree with you, and I have some plans with you for Germany to save it. So I want to invite you to be one of the people who help me.
Okay, so that's an official invitation for Ray, and I'm sure he'll be happy to accept it. We're going to move into questions and answers. I just want to say, because Helga will have to transition at some point here into helping to answer questions and be involved in it, I'm going to have Harley Schlanger, another person from the list, who will be helping to answer the questions. So we're going to go to questions now, begin it, and then actually after we begin the questions, I'll introduce Harley because he'll be one of the people answering the questions. So let's go, Julia Berg first.
Hello, I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you for organizing this event. It really is essential right now to continue speaking the truth and to continue talking about the issues arising. And I think it's a very important side effect of any war that truth is being revealed, sometimes in quite a painful way, but still it does help to reveal the truth and tear the masks down, and not just the COVID ones in this case. So I would like to make a brief comment on the topic directly related to the event, and then ask a question which I would like to address in the first place to the representatives of the Schiller Institute remaining here. So I'm also, as many people present at this event, I'm also on the kill list and the sanctions list and some other lists. And I want to say that what I see happening around those lists is that the fear that spreads across the expert communities, that spreads across journalist communities and other people is the key problem, because in terms of sanctions, for instance, I don't see any direct effects on my particular case or my particular life, but I do notice that people start avoiding, communication, avoiding taking part in discussion events, and discussion events are specifically what got me on all those lists, right? Conferences and public reports and this kind of thing. So once again, it's a good reason to thank the organizers of this event for the discussion that still continues, despite of all the threats, despite of all the fear that they're trying to plant around the experts, the journalists, the acting politicians, and everyone else who gets on those kill lists and related ones. But one of the issues, again, that I see right now is that there is not enough, in my opinion, not enough of constructive agenda. And for instance, the Schiller Institute, again, has been one of those rare institutions that is trying to communicate an alternative paradigm, let's say, analysis-based, value-based, and, you know, quite well thought through. Yet at the same time, when we talk about the current events and the threats that they pose and the risks of a global war and risks of nuclear attacks and many other ones, there is not enough of alternative scenarios being offered for discussion by the expert community. So the question that I would like to ask right now is, what do you think are the recipes for quality changes, and what do you think can be done by the people, by expert communities, by politicians and other groups of people in order to promote those constructive scenarios based on collaboration, based on balanced approaches that take into consideration interests of different groups, and what could, in this case, be an alternative for the globalist scenario that we see unfolding right now?
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. Harley, why don't you take that?
Okay, I'll be happy to. This is, of course, one of the major points that the Schiller Institute, as you referenced, has been fighting for. Not just a new security architecture, but a financial architecture. And it has a number of aspects to it. But the most important is to understand what is real economics. And this is part of what's being outlawed in the discussion. Economics in the modern era is neoliberalism. It's the idea of corporate cartels imposing policies on the rest of the world that benefit the bankers, the financial institutions, the big pharma, the grain cartels, and so on. And we see this in Ukraine. Look, one of the things that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union was that the West made a decision, and by the West, I mean largely the United States and the city of London, to go into Russia, go into Ukraine, go into Eastern Europe, and plunder those countries, which they couldn't do during the Warsaw Pact period. And they did that. They lowered the standard of living in Russia, in Ukraine, and it was actually that destruction of the standard of living which led to the rise of Putin. Now, here's the important alternative. The Schiller Institute in 1989, at that point, Lyndon LaRouche was in prison because they tried to silence him, but they couldn't do that. But he worked directly with Helga to put forward alternatives to the shock therapy policies that plundered Ukraine, plundered Russia, and other countries. And those were based on what eventually became the idea of acting for the benefit of the other, which included the idea which has become now the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, if you look at the Schiller Institute website, you'll see quite a bit of work that's been done on this alternative system. And it starts with a simple point. No more neoliberal economics. No more International Monetary Fund conditionalities. Sovereign nations have a right to act for the interests and well-being of their people. And countries like the United States and the nations of Europe should adopt that as their outlook, as their policy orientation. And this is what the global South has been waiting for so long, and why they're turning away from Europe and the United States now is because they've not been given the right to their own economic development. So I would say the starting point is you have to restore the traditions of national sovereignty, the break with the idea of a unipolar world, there's only one model, and allow countries to work together through negotiation, through cooperation on major development projects. And Lord knows we need tremendous investment in physical infrastructure, in capital goods production and trade. And this itself would reverse the collapse. Now, just quickly, as far as Ukraine is concerned, Ukraine has raw materials. It has wealthy or good farmland, which, by the way, is being sold off by Zelensky to the grain cartels. But Ukraine also has a very important location along the transportation connection between the integrated Eurasian economies and Europe. Instead, it's being turned into a looting ground and a battering ram against Russia. So I think that the important thing is that we need the new Bretton Woods proposal that Lyndon LaRouche put forward, guaranteed by the four powers, which he discussed, that is Russia, India, China, and the United States, which together have the power to overwhelm the forces of the new empire, the City of London, Wall Street empire of neoliberalism. So that's just a starting point to get at this question, but that's where the solutions will come from. Now, this is what the rest of the world is hoping for. That's why we see negotiations of a new financial system outside of the petrodollar system. That's why we see the talk between Russia and India of a ruble-rupee connection. The Eurasian Economic Forum and Sergei Glaziev talking about a financial system which invests in the physical productive capability of the future based on investment in scientific research and development and in the improvement of the labor force through education, healthcare, and so on. So I think that's where you have to look for the start for the solutions, so that we can avoid the kind of situation where a sole superpower can dictate terms to nations, and if nations don't go along with them, they'll be hit with regime change and war.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. Let me just say as we go on, because there's a lot of questions, not that people have to censor, but just try to sort of abbreviate and sort of focus the answer will be a little bit better, can get more in. I think the next questioner is J. Michael Springman, whose name I recognize. So, but everybody else may not. So when you get on, Mr. Springman, tell everybody who you are and whatever you got to say there.
I guess I'm unmuted now. Okay.
Yeah.
First, Mr. Speed, I purely admire your comfortable cat. And I'm glad to be back on your program with some old contacts, Red McGovern, Senator Black, and a new contact, Mr. Schlanger. First, I am an attorney, author, political commentator, and former U.S. diplomat. And what I want to do is make a comment to try and put everything we're talking about today in perspective. The United States, for the past century, has been trying to destroy first the Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation. Beginning in July 1918, Peace President Democrat Woodrow Wilson sent 13,000 American soldiers into the newly organizing Soviet Union to cooperate with the Czech Legion in destroying the country. Later on, after the Second World War, the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps picked up Nazi collaborators Stepan Bandera and Mykola Lebed and handed them off to the Lack of Intelligence Agency, which began organizing efforts to use covert operations and covert warfare to try and split off integral part of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine, and make it into a separate country that swore it would ally itself with Germany. Additionally, after the fear of nuclear war began to increase, the CIA began an operation called Aerodynamic, followed by QR Dynamic, followed by QR Plum, to essentially engage in propaganda warfare in the Ukraine and in the old Soviet Union, as well as in the United States, recruiting dissidents, recruiting unwitting Ukrainian authors, and publishing a lot of literature and shipping it off to the Ukraine and elsewhere, organizing conferences and so on. Later on, of course, we saw the peace president, Democrat Jimmy Carter, and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the son of a no-account Polish count, who organized another war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They recruited terrorists to fight against them after they had lured them into the country by disrupting the area, and then began to export this violence into the Soviet Union itself, into the Muslim socialist republics, in the hopes of destroying and breaking them apart from the Soviet Union. And of course, we had Graham Fuller on. He was a station chief in Kabul who organized this mess. Later on, of course, what we see now, beginning in 2003, was a campaign against the lawfully elected Ukrainian government. And in 2014, we had the overthrow of the government because it wanted a better economic deal with Russia than with the European Union. And the leader, of course, in this was the great Obamator, his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and Victoria Nuland, who is now the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the number 3 post in the department. They organized a revolution in 2014, led by the CIA station chief in Kiev, who used the name William Straub. And what we've got now, after this has been going on for, I guess, 8 years now, with the Ukraine-Nazi government murdering 14,000 ethnic Russians in the Donbass, we have actually open warfare between the United States and NATO and the Russian Federation, using, of course, the Ukraine as a proxy and probably killing more Ukrainians than Russians and destroying their economy. Yet we still give billions of dollars, and the European Union gives billions of dollars, and NATO gives billions of dollars to this crazy person, Zelensky, who is a failed actor, comedian, and who played the piano with his penis on television.
Well,
so I think we really need to look at American policy for the past century.
Could you, because we have to move on.
Sure, I'm done.
I don't mind the statement, but okay, is that pretty much it?
Yep.
Okay, because I'm sure Mr. Fuller and maybe also Ray will have something to say about that. But no, we actually thank you for the statement. Carlos Gomez, you are next. Please say who you are so people know. And
thank you, Dennis. Appreciate it. Carlos Gonzalez, by the way. That's okay. No worries. Want to thank the Schiller Institute as well as the distinguished guest today. Really appreciate it. The conversation. Couple of questions as it relates to what's happening. And the first and the foremost that I think could play a priority is that the determining the terrorist attacks in regards to the bombing, the explosion of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The first is that, what oversight committee or what investigation would be utilized to determine responsibility for that, knowing that it occurred in international waters, and likewise determining who is responsible, how potentially that would change the current events unfolding with Russia and Ukraine. So that's the first part. And then the second one is that, obviously a lot of the commentators today have discussed the information war that's occurring. And we know in specific that here recently, Elon Musk really kind of forced the conversation on Twitter, asking for peace, asking for negotiations. We know that Elon Musk, I believe, is closing on Twitter tomorrow, and just interested to see if the thoughts in general on how potentially that could change the conversation away from the narratives that's being pushed. Because unfortunately, it looks like if you look across the globe, it looks like the majority of political people are really backing Ukraine. Even the newly elected in Italy, Meloni was again just saying, "Hey, I have full support for Ukraine." So it looks like politically, unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's a solution to this. So what are the distinguished speakers' thoughts on those questions?
I think what I'm going to ask here is for Harley to start, but I want to also have either Ray and or Graham respond both to the last thing we heard and also to this. So Harley, why don't you get us started? Then we'll go to Ray and to Graham. You seem to be muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Ray and Graham would be better suited to answer the question about the investigation. Obviously, you can't have NATO do an investigation. At this point, it's questionable whether the United Nations would be reliable. We also saw the International Atomic Energy Agency punt on the whole question of the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. So the international agencies that in the past would look into this, most of them are, at this point at least, in the pocket of NATO and the United States. But if you are going to have an honest investigation, it should include the Russians, and it should include the Germans. And the Germans certainly have engineering technology and capabilities to do that. So I'll leave further delineation of that to either Ray or Graham. On Musk and the search for peace, look, there are very few people who have the courage to challenge these narratives. And by challenging them, I mean not just identifying the problem, but the solution. What always distinguished Lyndon LaRouche was he was never afraid to name the names of the people he thought responsible. And he engaged in intensive investigation, both on a historical and scientific standpoint and philosophical standpoint, to identify the problems. Now, how many people do that in the world today? And with all due respect to Elon Musk, I'm not sure that I wish him the best of luck in getting his peace initiative going. But unless he's willing to overturn some of the sacred cows, including the identification of the modern British Empire as at the center of these operations, it won't get very far. But I think I can say on what Carlos is asking, I wouldn't be so sure that the Italian government is going to end up supporting Ukraine and NATO. I think what we're seeing in the vote in Italy, a vote last weekend in Bulgaria, which defeated a very strong pro-NATO government, I think we're seeing the people beginning to march and start to change the subject and get to this question of what does it mean to be a sovereign nation? And that's where we come in. That's where the people come in. And what we're fighting for is to have as many people as possible engaged in the discussion. And the reason for groups like the Committee to Combat Disinformation and Mirotvorets is to intimidate people, to terrorize people, to be afraid to speak, and to talk about these deeper, more profound issues. Those who are on this panel and others, by speaking out, are encouraging others to get involved. And perhaps we can then move leaders of countries to recognize that their people are going in a different direction. So let me leave it at that.
Let me, before we go to Ray and then I guess to Graham, is just to indicate, I think Mira Tarada is also with us, the chairwoman of Foundation to Battle Injustice. We also had a video that we had to play from her. We're going to do that after these answers. So just wanted to say that. Go ahead, Ray, if you're going to.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. The UN is in the US pocket, pure and simple. The Russians and the Chinese still give lip service to the functions that the UN should be performing. But, back in the day, and this will be very brief, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, yellow cake uranium from deepest Africa. The last head of the International Atomic Energy Agency of the UN, El Baradei, told the UN Security Council, it took us only one day to find out that reports of yellow cake were not authentic, forged, all right? Now, there's a story there because he was replaced by a Japanese diplomat called Amano. And we know from WikiLeaks cables that Amano thanked the US so much for getting him into that position as head of the IAEA. And they say, oh, and by the way, I'm running out of little funds. I'd like to have no drapes in my office. And you think you could help on that? It's in the WikiLeaks cable. So that's where it all kind of started. El Baradei spoke the truth. That's not permitted. So in the US pocket, yes. Zaporozhye was mentioned. They send a delegation down. They can't get through to Zaporozhye because of the Ukrainian shelling. They get on site and then they still shell, and they can't figure out, well, where they're coming from. They're coming from across the river, but where is that? Coming from Ukrainian shelling, for God's sake. The other thing, of course, is chemical weapons use blamed on the Syrian government, shown 3 times now to be a total charade, as they say. Okay, so the UN is beyond repair in terms of these kinds of investigations. It will never, in my view, they will never permit the Russians to have the kind of role that they should have. Witness their exclusion from the MH17 investigation. You know, that the shoot down of the Malaysian plane there in July of 2014. So, you know, as long as the UN is under the US thumb, I don't think the Russians really expect any help from it. It will be probably left in this nether level land of he said and she said, but he said has a lot more substance to it because it's logical. She said has no substance at all because it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, Graham, you have anything that you'd like to add? He's there. We're not hearing you, Graham, if you're adding. Okay, I don't see him. By the way, I'll just make, is he there? No? So just one observation before we should go to the video that we have from Mira Terada.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, is that you, Graham?
Yeah, sorry.
Great, go.
Yeah. Ray raises a very interesting point about whether the UN is totally under US control or not, and as to whether it would be able to functionally get to the bottom, no pun intended, of this pipeline incident. I'm not sure I am quite as pessimistic as Ray is on this, in the sense that I think, first of all, we've been talking about the war for control of narrative and control of information. I think by now, simply on the basis of cui bono, who benefits mainly primarily from such an incident, that most of the world at this point has really come around to the point of view that it probably was the United States. This is not necessarily an informed view. I'm not even saying it's absolutely accurate, but I think the role of public opinion as we watch this thing unfold and who benefits from it will not leave the United States in a very comfortable position. And secondly, I'm hopeful, Ray also raised some more disturbing commentary on the nature of German society than I quite would. I'd have to say for years, in any case, I did have some hope that that Germany might be the only voice of sanity across Europe, with France occasionally kicking in usefully. But I've lost that sense of optimism now. But I wonder again whether when the cold weather sets in and the hardships and collapse of the economy and everything else, that there may not be much deeper exploration of all that took place in this that will leave us with perhaps a little better idea of who might have been involved in this ugly incident. Finally, just let me quickly make a comment about my own professional background in this case. Yes, I was chief of station in Kabul. However, I was not there. I left. I was there from 75 to 78. I witnessed the communist takeover of the country by the communist-oriented Air Force at the time, but I was not there during any of the period of the organization of Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. I should also point out, I think we have to have a little bit of historical perspective on this. the Cold War, I think, was a significantly different period than the contemporary situation of the world today. There were very clearly two global blocs. Sadly, the world was divided along these lines, and it was sort of a no-holds-barred conflict between Soviet Union and the United States, or Soviet Union and the West. So I think the values and standards by which the world operated and dealt with other countries in that period was probably significantly different. I'm not defending it all. There were many egregious aspects of the Cold War on both sides, but I think now our expectations are higher. These huge bipolar blocks of the world have fallen apart, and we're looking with some hope and aspirations towards a better world. And as several of our speakers have said, a less globalized world and a more a world in which sovereignty plays far greater role. I'm hopeful that that kind of a world will make it more difficult for a split along global lines as we had back in the Cold War days. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. So let's go to and this is in part done as a way of sort of reintroducing the themes that we had at the beginning, not that we've been away from them, but I just want to make sure that we have to make sure that we do that. So we have this from Mira Tirada, the chairwoman of the Foundation to Battle Injustice, followed by a statement also from another contributor, Mr. David Pine.
Death threats, blacklists, and Russophobia, how Ukraine and the NATO countries of Eastern Europe enforce non-legal practices to the world. Despite the fact that the Foundation to Battle Injustice, the Schiller Institute, and all of you, dear colleagues, attracted international attention to the problem of the Mirotvorets and caused its condemnation, the website continues to function as before and bring considerable public harm. Literally every day, nationalists put the data of dozens of people, including adults and children, politicians and public figures, clergy and teachers, into open access. The fact that people whose personal data was published on Mirotvorets received threats on the internet, and some of them even faced violence in real life, was said repeatedly and unable, sadly, to surprise anymore. The administrators and instructors of the Mirotvorets don't even think to stop their criminal activities, because of which journalists are still suffering nowadays. In mid-September, Italian journalist Mattia Sorbi, whose personal data was published on Mirotvorets, almost became another victim of Ukrainian nationalists. Having arrived in Ukraine to fulfill his professional duty, Sorbi, accompanied by 2 armed forces of Ukraine soldiers, went to the advanced positions of the Ukrainian troops. After a while, the escort left the car, the press representative the way to go. A few meters later, the car with the journalist was blown up. As it turned out, the road was mined. Mattia Sorbi was taken to the hospital by Russian servicemen. His life was saved. Presumably, the Ukrainian serviceman tried to eliminate the journalist according to Mirotvorets information, who accuses him of anti-Ukrainian propaganda. In early October, French journalist Adrien Bouquet, like his Italian colleague, almost became another victim of Ukrainian nationalists. A war correspondent who saw with his own eyes how in the spring the AFU fighters brought the bodies of dead people and laid them out on the streets of Bucha, thereby revealing the truth about the staging of the AFU, was attacked in Istanbul. The journalist is convinced that he became the target of an attack by unknown people because of his activities, which exposed the propaganda of Kiev. The work of the nationalist website inspired the Ukrainian government to create the so-called Center for Countering Disinformation, which was opened in March 2021 by decree of the Ukrainian president. This center positions itself as an organization created to combat current and predictable threats to national security and national interests of Ukraine in the information sphere, but in fact, it's a legalized and recognized copy of the Mirotvorets website. The Center for Countering Disinformation does not shy to use loud expressions accusing foreign journalists and public figures of pro-Russian propaganda. It's obvious that the center was created with one solid purpose: to manipulate the consciousness of Ukrainians, trying to provoke aggression from them toward everyone who does not agree with Kiev's position. In combination with the Mirotvorets, which contains personal information about some of those who are recognized by the Center for Countering Disinformation as a Russian agent, there is an additional approved at the state level risk to the life and safety of public figures criticizing Kiev. The Ukrainian state resource is trying to provoke aggression against well-known public figures, probably trying to attract the attention of their audience. John Merschmeyer, Tucker Carlson, Eva Bartlett, Glenn Greenwald, Steven Seagal, and Roger Waters, all those persons are accused of broadcasting an agenda that goes against the position of Kiev. And there is many more. Russophobia is far from a new phenomenon, but the Mirotvorets, the Center for Countering Disinformation, Ukrainian propagandists, and their instructors from NATO countries are spreading it not only in Ukraine, but also outside Ukraine. After the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, the level of hatred towards Russian citizens in Europe and the world has reached unprecedented heights. States are closing entry for Russian citizens. Monuments to Soviet liberators are being demolished in Eastern countries. The rights of Russians are being infringed on for political and Russophobic reasons. Some countries neglect the fundamental principles of world order, ignore legal and political norms, which reflects their historical and cultural terrorism. Vandalism, demolition of monuments, and threats reminded of the true face of a number of states for which any country or people who oppose the liberal doctrine is an outcast and an enemy. Ivan Melnikov, director of the Foundation to Protect National Historical Heritage and Lithuanian initiative group IMHO Club, launched an international campaign to save monuments in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland. Trying to abandon and attention, erase or change the past shared with Russia, the authorities of the Baltic and many other countries are ready to neglect the rights of their own residents. So on August 23rd, during the demolition of the monument to the liberators of Riga, local residents decided to gather in Victory Park to lay flowers and take a last look at the memorial. That evening, more than 150 sympathizers gathered near the monument, and a few hours later, the local police arrived, who immediately began arresting peaceful demonstrators. It's noteworthy that there were no people among the crowd who behaved aggressively. It was an action of farewell to the monument. No one resisted the police either. This did not prevent Latvian law enforcement agencies from using force and detaining 19 people, including women and children. Eyewitnesses said that the police roughly grabbed the protesters by the hands, pushed and dispersed the crowd. One man was detained for lighting a candle. The president of the Republic of Latvia said that the dissident people should be isolated from society, and Lithuanian Foreign Minister Edgar Rinkevich did not ignore the situation and said that all detainees should be deported. However, vandals get not only to monuments. Anti-Russian aggression directed to Russian shops, embassies, and Orthodox churches. The media has also repeatedly reported absurd bans for Russian-speaking citizens in Baltic states. They are banned from visiting restaurants, expelled from schools and universities, fired from work, and restricted to move freely on the streets. Inspired by the example of Lithuania, some European Union countries that want or have already blocked the entry of Russian citizens into their territory also support Russophobia. Finnair, Ryanair, Lufthansa staged a witch hunt with Russian passports. Reports continue to arrive that European airlines do not allow Russian citizens on board. The Prime Minister of Estonia said that Russian tourists are a danger and a threat to the security of the country, and also called for a ban on issuing visas for Russians who plan to visit EU countries. At the end of September, the Finnish Foreign Minister allowed a ban on the entry of tourists from Russia into the country, saying that Russian vacationers have no moral or ethical grounds for visiting Finland. Those and many other statements, as well as the introduction of discriminatory measures against Russian business, the seizure of Russian property, and the exclusion of participation in sports and cultural events by the Western politicians, indicate systematic discrimination on ethnic and linguistic grounds. Human rights defenders of the Foundation to Battle Injustice and I, Mira Tereda, have repeatedly appealed to the governments of Western countries, but since a certain time, all international human rights institutions became deaf and dumb. I hope that by conference, it will be able to draw attention to this urgent problem. We will continue to fight against the imposition of non-legal practices in the international sphere and will do everything in our power to close the Mirotvorets website. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank EIR for hosting this important press conference in response to the Ukraine's CCD's decision to post an updated blacklist. This one much expanded with a total of 35 Americans and other Western political leaders and thought makers that have dared to stand for peace against further Western involvement in this undeclared proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. One of those Americans, of course, is Fox News host Tucker Carlson. So that's kind of an interesting development. Just to provide a little background for myself, I currently work as Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. And I'm a former U.S. Army Combat Arms Officer. I've worked as an International Programs Manager for the Department of Army headquarters in charge of armaments cooperation with the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, and a number of other regions as well. I also have 2 graduate degrees, one of which is a master's in national security studies from Georgetown University. And I'm currently serving as a contributor to the National Interest Foreign Policy Journal. I'm also a contributor to the late Dr. Peter Pry's book, Blackout Warfare, as well as his sequel book, Will America Be Protected, which is due out later this year. And finally, I'm also editor of a newsletter called The Real War, which is available to read on dpyne.substack.com. So I think it goes without saying that the U.S. taxpayer-funded Orwellian named Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation is actually one of the main agencies charged with disseminating Ukrainian propaganda disinformation. And the purpose of this organization continues to be to influence, to kind of threaten and blackball any Western leaders or intellectuals who dare to question the prevailing narrative, which is being put out by the Biden regime media, that we have to fight Russia, and this is a kind of a huge fight, that Ukraine is somehow an ally. In fact, it's not in the national interest at all for the United States to be arming Ukraine to fight the Russians, because it can provoke Russia to escalate to the nuclear level. It seems increasingly likely against Ukraine, and that in turn could provoke a Western reaction that could lead to World War III, which could cost the lives of hundreds of millions of Americans and Europeans, and that's something we desperately need to avoid. So there's been a lot of developments. With the Russian annexation of 15% of Ukraine's territories, I do think Zelensky in particular, the Zelensky regime is becoming increasingly desperate. They have experienced some success in trying to take back about 6 to 8% of Russian-occupied territory, but they know their window's closing with the full Russian mobilization of their reservists, which is estimated to include at least 1.2 million reserve troops. Once those troops come to Ukraine, it could increase the size of Russian forces there by as much as 100%. And once that happens, the war is going to be decisively won by Russia, even without the use of nuclear weapons. So I think it's really important that we kind of bring back sanity to the discussion, and I'm grateful to EIR for helping to make that happen. And I look forward to answering any questions later in the conference. Thank you.
Let me also say, because we've gotten a ton of questions, that if there are questions that we need to forward to particular individuals, we will do so. There are various ways to contact us, which we can put at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to return now to the questions discussions. And the next person we have is Jeff Young. Now, Jeff Young is the Democratic Party candidate for U.S. Congress from Oklahoma, who is also an independent thinking person. So I want to make sure that he is up there. We've got him now. And
Kentucky, Dennis.
I'm sorry, I said Oklahoma. I'm sorry, I always do that with you. Kentucky. I don't like Kentucky. Oklahoma, I have friends. Kentucky, I never had any friends.
Oh, wow.
Sorry.
So, you have one now.
Okay, I'll take that as a beginning. You got to start somewhere. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you. I would like to answer a question raised about 5 minutes before noon by Julia Berg in the question and answer period. And she asked, at this time in history, what can be done and what can be done to prevent the globalists from implementing their agenda? What alternative is there to the kind of negative globalism that we have been talking about today? First, I want to thank the organizers of this conference, EIR and the Schiller Institute, this press conference. It is extremely valuable, and the speakers have been excellent, and we are addressing issues that the mainstream media in the West are simply shoving under the carpet. They're not being addressed at all, none of them. So my answer to Julia Berg's question is that the key is not Germany at this moment in history, October 6, 2022. The key is United States in Washington, the White House and the Congress in Washington, D.C., the CIA in Langley suburb in Virginia, and the Pentagon in Arlington. Germany at this point does not have agency. It does not have complete sovereignty. As some speakers have already noted, Germany is still an occupied country militarily by the United States. I am the Democratic nominee for 6th Congressional District in Kentucky. As far as I know, no other Democrat or Republican in Washington today, the US House or Senate, is aware of the danger that humanity is in at this moment. Some third-party candidates are aware of it, Diane Sayre and Matthew Ho. But as we know, third parties don't usually win in America. And so why I am running is to inject some sanity into Washington, to make people aware that we are on the cusp of a nuclear war that could wipe out human life on Earth forever. Extinction is forever. And so what matters most, in my opinion, is whether the US House will have one pro-peace, pro-diplomacy, anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-CIA representative in Congress in January of 2023, or zero. We have zero today. And if I lose to the Republican incumbent, I don't see any hope for alerting the American people fast enough to basically replace the current imperialist, savage, aggressive, warmongering government of the United States, the entire government, before they destroy the world. In the best case scenario, they will fail, and only the United States and Western Europe will collapse and sink into poverty, and the rest of the world will proceed and develop fine. In the worst case, the United States, the people who run the United States will decide that, well, if we can't be in power, we're going to end it all. Thank you again for inviting me to participate today.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Actually, I think what we'll do is, since you raised an important matter concerning the Congress and anybody who is involved there, Harley, I'd like you to speak to that, because of course we have some activity several people are engaged in, and I believe there are some rumblings or signs of something different from the Congress.
Well, I think we're going to explore that. I mean, we're getting out these calls that people are signing, these petitions, demanding an investigation of why is the US government sending billions of dollars for a war in Ukraine when American servicemen and servicewomen don't make enough money to provide food for their children, and children have to be on food stamps to eat. You know, there's a lot of anger in the population, and you know, I think the important question is what will catalyze the change. Just to say something about Germany, because it was brought up again by Jeff, the question of Germany is going to be determined in the next couple of weeks and months because of the likelihood of a cold winter. And you might ask, whatever happened to global warming? But the likelihood of a cold winter and the lack of any kind of electricity to heat homes, cook food, gasoline to travel, and so on. And we're starting to see a process very similar to what happened in 1989 in Eastern Germany. And I think this is something we can look at that is a classic case of what happens when you have a great moment and you find a little people. Well, the little people of Germany took to the streets, of East Germany, took to the streets. They were facing the Stasi, a communist dictatorship, and they rose up and overthrew it with lightning speed, but it actually took these Monday night demonstrations to take off. One week it's 100 at a church, the next week 1,000. And we're seeing a similar thing in the Czech Republic. Now, could that happen in the United States? And that's a question that is not going to be answered by the politicians, because most of them are already sold out. But I remember something from 2009 when Obama came in and he spoke to the bankers after the collapse of 2008. And what he said is, I'm the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks. And he went ahead and proceeded with the Bush bailout policy. Now, are there going to be pitchforks in the United States? And I don't mean to encourage violence, but will there this time around? be Americans who will stand up and finally say, no, we're not going to fund a war that could become a nuclear war. And it's a question of appealing to the conscience of every single person. And I think that's what we're doing with the Congress. We're going to be visiting with some congressmen today. People who are watching this video, download the calls that we have on the Schiller Institute website, sign them, circulate them, take them to your local groups, your trade unions, your co-workers, and so on. It's up to us to create that. If you're going to wait for a Democratic movement or a Republican Party movement, forget it. They will respond when they see people in the streets. And perhaps when they see the pitchforks, they'll respond.
All right, thank you, Harley. There's a question, Ray, that I'm going to direct at for you. This comes from something that came in actually during our meeting. There's an Italian general, retired, named Fabio Mini, and an article appeared. I don't know where it's from. I just have quotes, in which what he was describing was that the statement concerning a nuclear war cannot be won, and it should never be fought, pertains to fights among two nuclear nations, not necessarily between a nuclear and non-nuclear nation. He had a very particular set of formulations here. I just want to get them and see if you have anything to say about this. He said, every theater commander, such as the U.S. commander of U.S. forces in Europe, has permanent authority to employ the tactical nuclear weapons at his disposal. He was suggesting, obviously, that therefore meant that there was a geometry in which perhaps a nuclear weapon could be independently used. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. The reason I bring it up to you, Ray, is because 2 days ago, the National Security Archive called attention to their releasing of previously classified documents pertaining to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which they referred to as the 59-day Cuban Missile Crisis, not the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis. They specifically had a document by a Colonel Nikolai Beloborodov. I don't know if I'm saying it, Beloborodov, Beloborodov, I think that is. He had written a document in 1998. He was the person that was involved with the transshipment of the original weapons to Cuba. And he states that it was October 4th of 1962 when the weapons first arrived, and that the weapons were removed on December 1st, 1962. And that's the reason for the difference of the 59 days. He had a statement in his 1998 document, which has been put up there on the National Security Archive. And this, I'm going to read it. This is a quote. He said, it was clear. Now, remember, these are weapons placed in Cuba, nuclear weapons placed in Cuba. And Borodov says, it was clear that in the conditions of the existing balance of forces in conventional arms, which was 10-1 against us, there was only one way we could repel a massive assault: by using tactical nuclear weapons against the invaders. In principle, this action would be consistent with international law on the protection of sovereignty and freedom, but that would be the beginning of the end. Only madmen could unleash a nuclear war, end quote. So kind of a mouthful there, but I thought I would get it while we're on, and this had sort of come in just to get your reaction, both to the General Fabio Mini from Italy and this whole issue of the madness of the use of tactical weapons, but whether or not commanders actually do have some ability to use these weapons.
With respect to Europe, the U.S. Army, U.S. Armed Forces were willing and able, and it was their fallback position if there was a Russian invasion. The Russians did outnumber us in those days. That the fallback position default would be to use nuclear weapons, tactical ones, so things like Ostracism Actually, Colin Powell talks about one of his first tours of duty in Europe, and he was just really flabbergasted that he would be the person who ordered the retaliatory force against the Russian invasion. Now, Russians never came through the Fulda Gap. It was a balance of terror, and they knew what was going to be in store for them if they did, and they were quite happy to keep their own little socialist paradise, if you will, in the countries that were under their rule. Now, the whole question of how who can authorize a nuclear strike is really, really important. Imagine you're Vladimir Putin, right? And you're trying to figure out, these crazy people that run Stratcom now, the former SAC, that think that tactical nuclear weapons, well, yeah, we may have to use them, or these guys out, the Navy admirals in the 7th Fleet out in the Pacific, well, yeah, or people who write books like the former commander of NATO, what's his name, that little guy, Admiral Stavridis, yeah, saying, yeah, well, there'll be a nuclear war with China in 6 years, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so here's Putin looking on this, and he's saying, whoa, is there any reference material about whether these weapons have been devolved so that some of these crazy admirals or generals can fire them off? And his aides say, well, yes. Daniel Ellsberg wrote an incredible book. It's called The Doomsday Machine. And it says that contrary to what everyone else believed, there were generals and colonels at the tactical level, some of them stationed in Japan, that had prior authorization. Okay, so we talked a little bit before about Putin not wanting to have just 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes, God forbid, to decide whether to retaliate against these missiles that are coming in that he didn't know whether they had nuclear weapons on them or not. So just think about that. If Putin has to be conservative about this and has to think, well, maybe these crazy admirals and, generals, maybe they do have authorization. Maybe it's a default sort of thing that the president can't really react in time. So that's a real problem, okay? That's why we have to address this full on frontally. And it's not being addressed. It's just mostly rhetoric. Now, with respect to the rhetoric, we are hearing every day that Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons, okay? Well, he did something very unusual, right? Right when he invaded Ukraine, he reminded us that he had nuclear weapons, and he said, I'm going to put them on higher alert, okay? That was unusual. Russian leaders have not done that in the past. Okay, I've been around for 5 decades. Okay, they haven't done that in the past. Okay, so that was number one. And number two, what is really a concern here is whether he could use them in Ukraine. There's no military utility to using them in Ukraine. And most important, as for the rhetoric and the principal position that governments take, it's very clear. Russian doctrine says that Russia will use nuclear weapons in just one of two circumstances, okay? One is if nuclear weapons are fired at Russia, and number two, if the existence of the Russian state is in doubt, okay? All right, so let's just look at that thing. If the existence of the Russian state is in doubt. Now, what is Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, what are they all saying? Well, we're going to weaken Russia. Our real game is to weaken Russia by using Ukraine against it. And Biden says, but we don't want World War III. But they say, well, we're going to weaken Russia and we're going to put Putin's back up against the wall, okay? And then the head of the National Intelligence System, Avril Haines, says, if you put Putin's back up against the wall, he's likely then, and probably only then, to use nuclear weapons. So, do a little syllogism, you know? You don't have to be real bright to understand this. Why would you want to put Putin's back up against the wall? It's an existential threat to Putin. Final remark here. You mentioned Cuba, okay? Now, it was a year before my time at the CIA, but I know what happened, okay? We had very confident estimates saying the Russians would never put offensive missiles in Cuba because they know how we would react. Typical mirror imaging, crazy for analysis. They put missiles in Cuba, and then we said, well, we found them, Mr. President. President Kennedy, we found them because we got these fancy U-2. Okay, he said, all right, are they armed? And my former colleague said, well, we assess that they're not armed. Now, that's what they use now. We assess. That means what we used to say in the Army, the swag factor, a scientific wild ass guess, okay? We assess that they're not armed. And what could be more important than whether these medium-range ballistic missiles, right, targeted on major naval bases in the East Coast, whether they were armed or not? Well, it turns out, guess what, folks? We learned 3 decades later, they were armed with nuclear warheads. What am I saying here? I'm saying here that intelligence is a very iffy situation, particularly if you see the word assess. Okay, forget about assess. You have to talk to these people, and that's what's missing. Final word, during Cuba, JFK, John Kennedy, made sure that Llewellyn Thompson, old Soviet hand, former ambassador in Russia, who had just come back and had talked to Khrushchev, he made sure that Llewellyn Thompson was present at every one of those strategic planning meetings during the Cuban crisis. And so when these crazy generals and admirals say, "Oh, we can nuke them," and retaliatory, we'd only suffer about 20 million killed here in the States, right? Well, Llewellyn Thompson said, look, deal with Khrushchev, and Kennedy did. Now, compare that with today. The Russian leaders have given up on dealing with those clowns, and I use the word, I apologize to my friends that are clowns, but when you talk about Tony Blinken and you talk about Jake Sullivan, these guys are wet behind the ears. They're elitists. They still think the U.S. is exceptional, and they are very dangerous people because I think they tell Biden what to do. Long story short, nuclear weapons is really important. Don't believe the rhetoric that says Putin is threatening to use them, but do believe what the intelligence people say. Avril Haines is a smart woman. She's National Intelligence Director, and she has told the president in public, if you put Putin's back against the wall, then he's likely to use nuclear weapons. That happens to be true. So, ergo, put Putin's back against the wall? I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. And I'm going to thank everybody that participated today. We're now up almost on 3 hours in this session. We, of course, believe that every minute of it has been worth it. And we do and will answer questions if they were forwarded to us. You can contact us, obviously, through our website and otherwise. So I want to thank right now, take the occasion to thank Colonel Richard Black, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, Dr. Cliff Kirikov, Eva Bartlett, Graham Fuller, Diane Sayre, David Pine, Mira Tirada, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Broussard, and Harley Schlanger for their participation today. We will not be silenced, speaking truth in times of war. And this will be posted shortly, so you'll be able to get the full proceedings and review them. And again, if there are questions that come up in the aftermath of this, or you want to in other ways contact us to participate, please do so. So thank you and good evening. All right.
All right. There you have it, everyone. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today, and also want to thank the Schiller Institute and Harley Schlinger for coordinating this and allowing us to have this stream today. Everyone enjoy your day, be safe, and we will be back tomorrow on Friday. Take care and God bless. Bye-bye. Everyone enjoy your day.